Good day and welcome to episode 6 of our fall 2022 season of the Constitution in American Life with the Friends of Publius. The Friends are, of course, Professor Tim Moore from the Center on the Study of the Constitution at the University of Wisconsin, Professor Chris Kavanaugh, meritorious teacher, currently teaching in Bismarck, North Dakota, as well as a longtime mentor in the Center for Civic Ed's We the People program. And also we have our rock star, Dr. James Michael Williams, professor of political science and international relations at the University of San Diego, where he is also director of the Changemaker program. And myself, David Richmond, former We the People teacher, mentor, former director of the Center for Civic Ed's National We the People Institutes, former state coordinator of the Center for Civic Ed's programs in California, and now retired individual that doesn't know what day it is in any week of the year. I don't even know if I know what month it is. But then again, we finally broke out of the 90s and we were hitting the 80s there and hit our first morning of degrees in the 50s. So
1990s or 1980s?
I'm trying to temperature.
Temperature.
But you're right. We are a little bit behind the curve when it comes to pop culture, unless you consider country music there, Mr. Kavanaugh. Because remember, Bakersfield is known as Nashville West. All right, so we're on the cutting edge of country music.
There's only two types of music: country and western.
Okay, I got that, and that maybe one of our future gatherings you can help me distinguish between the two. Which type sings about their dogs and ex-girlfriends and trucks?
Country.
Okay. What's western focus on? Prairie?
It can be a swing, a little bit of western swing.
See, I should pay more attention.
Love it. Throw a little
Lyle Love it. Yeah, Lyle
Love
Love it.
in
Exactly.
there.
I should have paid more attention in my music appreciation course there. So, but that was a required course when I was playing baseball in college. All right, you will take music appreciation, and of course the baseball class. I think I had 12 units, 3 of which had nothing to do with academics whatsoever, which is why I'm a stellar academic today. So, anyway, that's our team here, the Friends of Publius, and the Friends. No one can say that I don't know my baseball. As predicted, the winningest team of the past decade failed once again to make it to the World Series. Just goes to show that all the data in the world cannot replace the character of the player or the team that competes. I now turn my loyalties over to the Cleveland Guardians, and if they lose tonight, I will cease being a baseball fan for 2022 and look forward, of course, to 2023, because we always know, especially those Cubs fans, there's always next year. So today we are going to be addressing issues related to the first branch of government, the Congress. What I have come to understand about the institution is that that is a great way to confuse visitors to our country. You really want to screw with someone's head, just begin to describe the inner workings of the House and the Senate. In this session, we hope to bring as much clarity to this bicameral branch as we can. We will reference history, theory, and the aspirations of the framers as we address the ideals versus the realities of congressional power. I think that the key question I hope we can discuss is whether or not an institution of government designed upon the foundation of polarization can be damaged, in fact, by polarization. We also hope to bring some light to theories of representation and provide the standards of good representation and good government. So let's begin our discussion with our expert on the 18th century, and that is Professor Tim Moore. So Professor Moore, we talk in basic civics about the 3 branches of government. I looked at a lot of visuals on Google today, and they all have 3 branches of government. But in reality, don't you think we have 4 branches of government, given that the House and the Senate act in many ways independently of each other?
Actually, I'll see you and raise you. I might propose we have five.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think your point about the independency of each house in the Congress is a well taken. I mean, you asked any representative, and I mean the common joke is if you're talking to a member of the House, the common joke is the enemy is not the opposite party of which I'm a part of. It's the Senate. So there's a lot of animosity between the House and the Senate and how independent they are and how the Senate is perceived where everything goes to die. So I think your point's well taken that there are four branches, but and this, I know this isn't a part of our topic tonight, but I would recommend for your consideration that maybe agencies is the fifth. I know they're created by Congress and many of them fall under the aegis of the executive, but man, oh man, they have a great deal of independence. I mean, they actually kind of create codes.
Well, if we could put that kind of in the past tense, they have had. But I think if this court
sure.
has anything to say,
Sure.
we're going to see the diminishing.
Sure, but
that is an interesting point.
So yeah, I mean, I think for a long time they have functioned a lot like a different branch, but I think we do have four branches given the independency of the two houses from each other. Yeah.
Well, was the creation of this bicameral legislature an extension of just the general constitutional theory of those present in Philadelphia, or was it like so much just a byproduct of practical politics and the necessity of compromise?
I tend to side on practice more than theory. Although I mean, there's a rich tradition of bicameralism. I mean, heck, it goes back arguably to the Roman Republic when you have these different pieces of their legislative entities. But even there, I'd say that kind of falls in the silo of practice. I know. Harrington was a writer. He wrote a speculative piece called Oceana in this perfect world that he was creating. This is like the 1500s, I think. He made a philosophical argument for kind of an upper house. I think he may have actually used the word Senate in this book. So, I mean, the theory goes back a long ways, but I think the practice, colonial legislatures were bicameral. The early state constitutions, 11 of 13 were bicameral. Georgia and Pennsylvania were not. So I think the practice in just the inertia of having bicameralism throughout the colonial and founding period, it weighs heavily. I mean, and there in the 1780s, there's this big fight there's a big fight in the country, and Adams articulates bicameralism in the defense of American constitutions, where Paine articulates unicameralism. And most people reject Paine's view that unicameralism is the way to go. So I think the practice is more weighty than the theory.
Well, I'll hold off on, I think, my next question there. I want to move on to Professor Kavanaugh and wonder that if you would agree with me on this, that Chris, that the checks that exist between the House and the Senate are in many ways more effective than in limiting government power than the checks between the other branches of government, the presidential checks on Congress, the judicial checks. It's really the internal checks that I guess protect us from a tyrannical and abusive government. Do you agree with that?
Yes and no. I think so much of it depends on the time frame on which you speak. I think that I think I heard Tim actually say this one time. I think so much of it for the students listening is the fear of a concentration of power. So not only did they divide power between three branches, they also instituted as federalism, that dividing it this way, but then they even took the legislative power and divided that as well. So there's this, I think, this division of power with you see either, on the x-axis or y-axis, depending on how you want to build your model. It was more so about a concentration of power. I think that what's happened now in the modern sense, David, is a division between the two chambers So much of it is back to the idea of perhaps divided government. I don't know that I mean, I was trying to do a little research for tonight's program and thinking about the actual checks each, chamber has on each other. And I'm not sure, other than, moving legislation along and back and forth and perhaps creating conference committees, that, Tim mentioned earlier, if you remember the House, do you think the Senate is a place where bills go to die? I remember a few years ago, I actually had the privilege of sitting down with John Boehner, with just myself and him and a couple other people when he was House Majority Leader. And this is a quote from John Boehner that stuck with me. He said there might as well be the Great Wall of China between the House and the Senate. And then the Senate historian, Ritchie, I was with him, and he said, you think of the Senate as the, a good liberal arts school where you have to have this background in a lot of different things, and think of the House as a good engineering school where you have to pick your area of expertise. But even in a modern sense, there's a division there, but I don't know that what are the checks between, I'll ask you guys, what are the checks between the chambers?
Well, I think you mentioned, the singular most powerful one, and that is the legislative check on even taking up, whether it be in committee or just in the full House or Senate, taking up legislation that came from the other branch. So, but there, as you said, forming joint committees, I think about the politics surrounding the January 6th committee. And would it be seen by 45% of the American people as not legitimate or as a political rather than legislative process if it had more Republican representation? Now, I think we might all agree that the reason that January 6th committee doesn't have more Republican representation were the actions of the majority leader in the House, or not, the minority leader, I'm sorry, Kevin McCarthy, and not agreeing, he and the speaker not agreeing on who would be, on that there. And I wonder why, and maybe you guys can clarify me, was there ever an idea of having a joint committee investigate January 6th?
I think early on, and I'm hoping I'm not talking out of my ear here. I think early on there was the idea was there, and I think that was shot down by folks. And so I think Speaker Pelosi took it upon herself to create a select committee. And right. Then when McCarthy put forth some names, and a couple of the names that I think Jim Jordan was one, I think Banks from Indiana was another, that were, I will call them election deniers. And so I think Speaker Pelosi said there's no point in having these people on the committee if they're going to deny the outcome of the 2020 election. And so you end up with Kinzinger and Cheney, obviously, as the two Republicans on the committee. But of course, now we've seen through party politics, those folks have been ostracized, and basically, I think Kinzinger is done, and as is Cheney. Well, she lost a primary, but I don't know that Representative Cheney is done from politics.
Well, so I debated whether to use checks in the plural or check, and it is that legislative process. And it seems to me that the perception of the ineffectiveness of government, is predominantly found in the Congress, and it is that one power, the legislative process, that can, bind the national government into knots in such a way that we end up with, again, inefficient and ineffective government. But I did wonder if there's any other, and Chris or Mike or Tim, are you aware of any other checks between the branches other than the two that Chris mentioned?
Well, the origin of money bills is kind of a check against the Senate. But I mean, not much. I mean, because through the process, the Senate has tremendous influence on that.
Well, I guess it would. I was thinking, if the Senate, which has now, I'm thinking way outside the box into the world of imagination and falsehood. I was trying to think about the foreign policy powers of the Senate
Yeah.
and the revenue powers of the House, if somehow that could be problematic.
Well, yeah, the House tried that very early in the 1790s when they wanted to weigh in and on the Jay Treaty, and they threatened to they wanted to see some of the paperwork that was involved in the Jay Treaty, and so they did threaten to withhold money on a negotiated treaty, and but it didn't go anywhere. I mean, Washington basically told them that they didn't have a role in treaty making. They may have the power of the purse, but they, so the House did try very early to kind of sneak its nose under the tent, so to speak.
Tim, I want to ask you a question, because I was looking, but I really couldn't. Was there an anti-federalist groundswell against the way the legislative branch was constructed, specifically about the division between the House?
No, during ratification, I checked this today because I wanted to be sure that I was right on this. There was hardly any anti-federalist criticism of bicameralism. So, I mean, there was a few, there was a couple of essays in Virginia, and then, of course, Luther Martin, he's kind of a loose cannon, but for the most part, there's not an argument against structure. Most people believe bicameral is valid. The criticisms of anti-federalists was the powers delegated within the bicameral system. It wasn't the structure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, wasn't there also?
I mean, if that answers your question, Chris.
It does.
Wasn't there some concern with the 6-year term?
Oh, sure, but the structure itself of having two houses wasn't. I mean, yeah, the anti-federalists go nuts on. Well, they go nuts on all the terms. 2 years. They don't like 2 years in the House, 4 president and 6 Senate. So, but if Chris was asking just about structure, not much at all. I mean, there's one interesting essayist in Virginia. His name was Rusticus, and I don't know who that was, but he made the argument that the Senate actually, this was an argument against bicameralism, it will increase the factions when you add another house. I just get a kick out of that. But, I think much of the anti-federalist argument realizes bicameralism is a fait accompli. So they argued about powers.
Mike, you were going to say something a while ago.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure if this is a check, but the way the impeachment powers are divided seems to be something to think about. I mean, without the Senate's role of conviction, if the House were just in control of it, it'd be more like a vote of no confidence. So in some ways, if we're playing up this institutional rivalry that kind of Chris and Tim have raised, that I would argue is one of the things that's really changed in this era of polarization, then maybe that is a check. Maybe that's a way for the Senate as an institution to make sure that the House doesn't get carried away with the passions of the people and start impeaching folks without really doing their work.
Well, that's why I would echo Mike that's why I said yes and no, David, to your original question, because now I think that it's the process of political loyalty, not loyalty to an institution, whether it be the House or the Senate or the executive or judicial, that ambition being made to counteract ambition, as Madison said. So now I think there's even a greater division within Congress itself. But
you would agree with me. It seems to me that simultaneously to, and again, the rise of party power is going to affect all the branches to some degree. It seems that simultaneous to this, inability of the House and Senate to work together in any way, shape, or form, Congress is also kind of weakening their checks on the executive branch. Now, would you agree with me on that?
Oh, clearly. Yeah, I think what we've seen so much of lately, I don't say lately, what I'm saying in the last 50 years, and maybe even more, maybe post-World War II, maybe with the advent of nuclear weapons, I'm not sure, but you've seen Congress have they given up their power? Has the executive taken that power? Because I think we're aware of, and Tim, you certainly can correct me, but I think that the framers were very fearful of the legislative branch. That was as Madison called it, the impetuous vortex. And so they want to do what they can to try and control that. And that's where they're worried about abuses of power coming. And I think what we've seen in a modern sense is you've seen Congress, for lack of political will, for lack of, because of political partisanship, they struggle to get stuff done. And so you see an executive step in because nature abhors a vacuum. And if the Congress is not going to use its power, then the president will. And for the students watching, a modern example would be immigration. That's a legislative power. Congress, according to the Constitution, has that power, but everybody looks to the president now to solve this issue. And it's a legislative power. So therein is a current example of Congress not stepping in, using its power, perhaps being, as I like to call it, feckless. And then the president steps in to use that power. And to Tim's point as well about, executive agencies have filled that void as well.
Yeah.
Well, this is kind of to all of you. I am curious. The progressives tried in some ways to infuse a little bit more democracy into the system through the 17th Amendment. Do you think the 17th Amendment, from a historical perspective, had any effect in changing the nature of the Senate? Did it actually achieve what the progressives had hoped it would achieve?
Well, if accountability was the goal, no. I mean, I don't think they're any more accountable before the 17th Amendment as opposed to after.
Chris or Mike?
I would say originally, yes. Where we are today, no. Because, I mean, you understand the 17th Amendment was ratified about the same time the Income Tax Amendment was ratified, the 16th and 17th, both in 1913, I believe. And so, David, you identified it correctly in terms of that progressive movement. Because if you look at what was happening, in our state next door, William Clark, who owned the largest copper mine, one of the largest copper mines in the world, was so brazen, he went to the Montana State Legislature and said, I would like to be a senator, and started handing out envelopes with $10,000 in them with his initials on the envelopes. So, you can understand the pushback during that progressive time frame for that direct election of senators.
But that was not constitutionally prohibited.
Well, no, it's not. Bribery is not constitutionally prohibited. Graft and corruption is not constitutionally prohibited. And we know that as long as there are politicians, there will be graft and corruption. They are, like Donnie and Marie, they kind of go together. I'm dating myself for the students there. But I think what we've seen since that 100-year time period, you started, and this is one of my problems with some of the language, and I think one of the bullets of this question is, I think you see the cost for running for office so great, then
we've come full circle.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the Georgian Senate race right now has spent more, and it's like $140 million.
Yeah.
Between the two of them.
Yep.
And you're kind of wondering, how is that, citizen representation, their kind of stuff. Mike, any thoughts about, do you think the 17th Amendment in any way changed the not the design, obviously, I mean, it did to a small degree, but just changed the function of the Senate, that it had the outcome that the progressives were hoping for? And I think Tim's right, responsiveness to the people.
No, I think it definitely changed it. I mean, look, the Constitution that was designed in the 1780s, right, it was very elite focused, and there were multiple filters kind of built in with how we elect presidents, how we elect the Senate, and it was the Senate was meant to represent states' interests. So when I look at the 17th Amendment, I think there were good reasons at the time that the progressives saw that as a solution. but to me, it completely now, it's disingenuous now to say that our federal system represents states' interests. When individual senators get to decide for themselves what the state interest is, they're not accountable to the state legislatures at all.
Right,
as were in
right.
the past. And it's brought into our system this additional element of small d democracy that I'm not saying I'm against it. I'm just saying the founders, as I understand it, Tim, correct me on this, and all of you correct me on this, they thought of the government as this like machine, right? They were trying to like think of like, they had their Enlightenment hats on and they thought this is going to be this machine, it's going to work in this way. And the 17th Amendment really changed how that machine works. And far be it for me to say whether it was for good or for ill, but it definitely changes the way that states' interests are like discussed at the national level, for sure.
So one of the things students are asked to deal with, and I struggle with this all the time, and not struggle, yeah, I struggle with it. I'll just be damn honest with myself. And yes, I struggle with it. And I'm uncomfortable with the term polarization. So Professor Williams, it seems to me our Constitution was designed to work within a polarized political culture. Do you agree with me?
Sure, I do. I think that the system was designed, well, it was designed to, as I was just saying, to limit the influence of the people. Like, in my opinion, it was designed to make sure that people didn't have too much say. And when people did get their say, it was meant to like diffuse that to a way where you could have polarization, but it would diffuse it in the system so that things could get done. So as what I see, I mean, today, so beginning in 1965, as I've said in other programs, is when we become a liberal democracy. And we mark the beginning of this. The parties today are ideologically more apart than they've been in 50 years. And it's just about, it's the early 70s. And we've talked about this on different programs. As we became a fully democratized system, I'm not sure if the system as it was designed in the 1780s can handle the kind of polarization or the intense, passionate interests that are now have a voice. It's changed that dynamic, and I think it times up squarely with becoming more democratized as a society.
Well, just thinking about the famous story that Washington tells Jefferson about the House and the Senate, right? So it's interesting, Mike, to listen to your language. It makes me think of the cup and the saucer and the hot coffee, right? So the passion is supposed to be the House, the branch closest to the people. That's the hot coffee cup, and then you pour your hot coffee into the saucer, which is the Senate to cool. But yet we don't have that effect anymore. So sorry, Tim, you want to jump in?
No, I'm gonna do a little. I think I'm gonna push back a little bit, David. If you mean polarization in the sense that there's a polar opposite, I don't think our Constitution was designed for polarization. I think if we take Madison seriously about factions, he envisions a whole lot of mini parties called, he calls them factions. And I think this is where he's naive, and many of the founders are naive, because I think political parties messes everything up, or makes our constitutional design much more difficult. Now, if Madison's vision of multiple factions all over the country, having differing interests, and they're supposed to meet in the arena and beat each other up and reach compromise, I think if that would have played out, I think the machine would have gone by itself. But a political party, now, so I say they're naive, and political parties' polarization was not what they wanted. They wanted multiple polarizations.
Well, some might say that in a nation state, the logical end is that that all of these factions, even if we enlarge and refine, are going to come down to two. All right, and again, in the 1790s, we've got polarization that is broken down into two,
Right.
more or less. And then, in the antebellum period, articulated most in the 1850s, were broken down into two. There, go ahead, Mike.
I mean, I see your point. I think it's hard. Okay, at the beginning, there were two factions that had the ability and the freedom to voice their different concerns, right? But really, at the time, in the 1780s, you think there was just Federalists, anti-Federalists? I mean, if
no, but in the organizational scheme of things, yes, Mike, I think that's how it breaks down. That, yes, I don't think that the factions that we have today, all right, are one dimensional. I don't think all Democrats, all right, agree on all things, and I don't think all Republicans do. Yet you have to have a big tent and a nation the size that we are, even in the 1790s and the 1850s. The organizational scheme is it's going to weed its way into two dominant factions in that sense.
I would push back a little, saying there's nothing natural about that. And if we're going to go back into the weeds a little bit, the electoral system you designed determines that, right? And the first past the post system, right, is the one. So I'm just saying, if California had a PR, proportional representation system, we would have way more than two parties.
Yeah.
And it's not like a natural thing. Oh, there's just always been these two factions. The two factions designed a system to make sure there are only two factions. And maybe that's what you're saying, but I'm just saying that there are way more than two out there.
Right. They created
the political parties. I think some of this is why I'm kind of grumpy, like really grumpy with the founders, because they knew there are two parties during the revolution. They talked about, it's interesting. You look at the records of the Continental Congresses, both the first one and the second Continental Congresses, they're already talking about this division, and they see it as a binary. They see it as a binary. There's loyalists and there's patriots. Now there's shades within those. There are factions, I suppose, within those, if you want to use that phrase. But this is why I think Madison is so wrong, given that legacy of two overarching big tents. That's why I think Madison is really, really naive to assume that there'd be these flourishing of factions.
Well, Mike, I guess where I wanted to get to is, and it seems that you agree with the assumption and implication of the question. To me, the question seems to imply and assume that polarization today is worse than at any time, all right, in our history, and that it damages or has had tremendous, negative influence on the workings of Congress. And am I right to in my assumption about you that you agree with that polarization today is worse than the late 1790s, the 1850s, heck, 1968, late 1960s, early 70s? Are you with that?
Well, I'm hesitant to go past what I can see in the data. So I don't want to get into like we are more divided today, polarized, than we have been in the last 50 years. And I would say probably more so than going back to the early 20th century. Now, the Civil War period and the founding period are special periods. And I'm not going to say that wasn't as polarized as today. I think that, I don't know. Right? My reading of the history would be like, yeah, those seem like pretty polarized times. I mean, there was bloodshed like continually. So, but in modern times, yeah, I think so, for sure.
I think the 1850s might help us here a little bit, thinking about the collapse of the Whig Party. You've got, there's a flourishing of parties after the Whigs collapsed. And so for us to, I guess for us to answer, are we more polarized now than the 1850s? Well, I don't know. Let's see if one of the parties today falls apart, and how many smaller parties will emerge out of that. That might that might give us a clue as to whether we're polarized or not.
Well, I don't know if that has to be the standard. I'd say let's see what happens after 20.
Well, that's what that's what historians do. We're very reticent to talk about anything that's going on right now.
Wow, let's see. I got Chris talking about charts and graphs, and Mike's talking about data, and now Tim says you got to have. Okay, that's why you guys are the scholars, and I'm just the.
I'm going to go back for the students that are watching. When Mike uses the term "first past the post," and really it's the system that was created by the Constitution. And there's a guy that I'll put a link to. I'll send a link to. His name is Duverger, and Duverger's law is whenever you have a first past the post system, inevitably you will only have two parties. And so when those two parties get to make the rules about who gets to join the group or who gets to participate, obviously they're going to make the rules much differ for other people to join into this debate. So then,
but aren't states free to set up their own systems at the state level?
Well, they could be.
Yeah,
to a degree, but it goes back to the term David used earlier with that big tent. So you think about political parties, this is an interesting debate about political parties. Are political parties factions? Are there factions within political parties? I would argue that you have factions within the Democratic Party today, but I would say there are not factions within the Republican Party today because you can see anybody that doesn't toe the party line becomes a rhino and ostracized. So I would and I would wonder, Tim, when we talk about maybe one of the parties falling apart, I wonder what's going to happen to the grand old party in the next 5 to 10 years, given the fact that, there's so many people within the party itself that do not put a lot of credence in how we elect our representatives.
So Professor Moore and I, gosh, when I thought this question up, I could feel the slap across the face coming my way. But I want you to assume for the moment that our government was designed to function effectively and somewhat, efficiently. In theory, how is that interaction between the House and Senate intended to uphold good government and not be trapped by constant paralysis? In theory.
I think it maybe a place to start on that is to flesh out what the framers thought should be represented. The framers had some degree of commitment to small d democracy, and that's how people needed representation. There's that proportionality principle that showed up in the Virginia plan. But then they also have this representational commitment to people and places, people and states specifically, plays into this this theory that this representing people and places was important, and whether they were naive enough to or not to assume that representational scheme would be I think they would argue that it's been effective. Up to maybe the 17th Amendment. Now, to your point about efficiency, that's a different question, because I think too much democracy in the Senate has made it less efficient because they're more beholden to people rather than a state legislature. So I think at root, to flesh out whether it's effective and efficient, you have to understand what their commitments were as to what needed representation. And there's a long legacy preceding the founders of state sovereignty and state specialness based upon that sovereignty in the colonial era.
I agree with that. I would just also add that I think the founders probably have a different opinion about the role of government than we would today. So, if you think about, of course, there were some who wanted more active government, less active government, but the things that Congress was supposed to get done were meant to be limited, right? It was meant to be like the basics. For a lot of reasons that we've talked about in other programs, the national government now is just responsible for a lot more things. And I think that along with the polarization, just adds to the the difficulties of Congress doing its basic job, right? The basic job has changed in a way that maybe the founders wouldn't recognize over the last 200 plus years.
I don't know if I agree with that, Mike. I mean, I agree that there's a debate in the in the 1790s, and I really put it more into the lap of the first Congress to articulate who we are than I do the framers or the ratifiers. So the difference in that view of government reflects the differences just in society in general. But I think there's a debate when you say they were only supposed to do the basics. Well, if that's the case, how do you explain the general welfare clause in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 for tax purposes, the general welfare, and how do you explain necessary and proper? So to me, they had they had a premonition. They had an understanding, mainly because history was one of the primary forms of literature that these guys dealt with, that since the world had changed to such a degree before they arrived on the scene, that the world was going to change. And Hamilton, I think, reflects the that change that's beginning to emerge. So I don't know if necessarily they believed in limited government as just doing the basics there. I think that some of them had an expansive view, and that you're going to need a government that's going to be able to adapt and change to those things that are coming to in the future.
I think if you're going to put Hamilton as a activist, big government guy, I'm not sure I'd go that far, because I think if you see Hamilton in the context, he sees debt as a very basic issue to deal with. And so we look at it post New Deal and see his plan as a kind of a big government plan. And actually it's taught that way, I think, a lot. But I would say Hamilton isn't necessarily a big government guy. He's meeting a tremendous need that requires the federal government to do basic things. I think dealing with the debt is a basic thing. I don't see that as a big government thing. I think we put that label on it post New Deal.
But as you very well know, one of the key debates, in Congress, and obviously the executive branch to some degree is involved, given that it's Hamilton as Secretary of Treasury, is how to deal with debt. And again, I think the standard is the word you might use. The tradition is that people were somewhat shocked by Hamilton's debt proposal, all right, and the ability to borrow to such a degree. And I could be, again, out in left field there, Professor Moore, but wasn't he kind of, a groundbreaker in that sense?
States dealt with debt a lot prior to the creation of the Constitution. So there's all kinds of deficit spending that's going on. I would say Hamilton's financial plan was most problematic to most people on the issue of non-discrimination. In other words, we're not going to try to find the original owners of this debt. We're just going to pay it off to whoever's holding it. So the consolidation of debt and the non-discrimination of payment of that debt was more problematic to most people. Now, Jefferson aside, because he saw that a little bit differently. But I think for most people, it's that one facet of Hamilton's plan that was most problematic.
Well, I'm really curious, Mike. Is it your contention that, do you think the framers, let's just deal with the 20th century. We'll stay away from the current century. Let's just deal with, do you think the framers sometime in the 20th century would have been blown away by what Congress had or legislation Congress had passed? And again, I understand that they had no way to even understand what kind of world would exist, but just looking at the powers that Congress used in the 20th century, would they have been like, oh my God, that's not what we meant?
I do. I mean, I think some of the changes that the New Deal kind of brought forth really expanded the notion of the original idea of what government was supposed to do. Now, I'm not saying, it's not that I disagree or agree with it. I'm just saying what do you think Hamilton would say that we have a Department of Education?
Right.
And that Congress is passing laws on education. I think that that's just one example of, I think, many. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Like, I mean, it's just like we now have the political scientists, someone refer to this as our state scope. Like the amount of things that is under the national government as a scope, right? We all can admit it's greatly expanded. And I guess the question is is that something that the founders were smart enough to know that they could envision this or not? I guess I would lean to say probably not, but if you're kind of leaning in, no, with the general welfare clause and other things, maybe they have, I guess. I mean, we haven't told our viewers that next week we are going to have Thomas Jefferson and Hamilton on, so we could just ask them next week, but I don't.
Student seat, I want you to know that Professor Williams came down with COVID this last week, and I don't know what kind of medications he's on. And I don't know in whose mind we're going to have Jefferson and Hamilton sitting down with us on a Zoom thing. That might blow their minds in some way. I guess what I would say to that, when you say the Department of Education, that's a wonderful trick there. But you know as well as I do that, let me ask you this. What would Hamilton say to the Civil Rights Act? Is the Civil Rights Act within the power of Congress?
Well, if you take 14th Amendment Section 5 seriously, yes.
Okay. So, and again, if anything, Hamilton, as far as, the text, he's a loose constructionist there. And I think as well as I do, Mike, that the reason we have a Department of Education is to enforce civil rights in public schools, is to create a national agency to do that. It does not deal with curriculum. It does not deal with teacher licensing. Now, I might agree, and again, it really doesn't deal with assessment, because the assessments that both the Bush and Obama administrations created, they were voluntary. You did not have to comply. You didn't have to comply unless you wanted federal dollars.
Okay.
Therein lies the answer to all of this is money. Is money, because you have the trough of Congress, right? This big teat of government where states are refusing, or they don't have the wherewithal or the money to be able to provide for these services. And so what happens? People go to the national, they go to Big Daddy in Washington and that deep trough. And so I would push back a little bit on that with No Child Left Behind and Every Child Succeeds Act, because if you want those federal dollars, which every school system needs, then you've got to jump in and play the game. And so what happens is you have a lot of states, they don't have the dollars for various services. And so what we start to see is we see the federal government take a larger role, because it's much like I called Congress feckless. I think states to a degree have also taken a step back because of the idea that we don't have the wherewithal, we don't have the financial wherewithal to be able to enact some of these programs, but we know there are federal dollars available.
Okay, I'll stop there. But I again, and
I mean, to your point, I think like the framers would look at the Federal Writers Project during the New Deal, a lot of those artsy things that we still kind of chuckle at that, like, really, that was a part of the New Deal. So I think those kinds of things, they'd look at the NEA and the NEH that we have now, and I think they'd kind of scratch their heads. I mean, I know Adams proposed a national university and proposed an observatory. He had this Whig pretty loose view of what the Congress could do too. But I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff they would really wonder about. I really do.
I'll just say I'll take a loose constructionist viewpoint, Professor Moore, on Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8, to promote the progress of science and useful arts.
I'm not arguing against it. I'm just saying the founders would look at it and they go, well, how did we get from that to where we are today? I think they would wonder about that.
And I see the spirit of this discussion is that, I mean, I would tell the students, Yeah, you should understand what the founders may have wanted, but to some extent, I would encourage you to kind of say that doesn't matter for what you should be thinking about the role of government. But sorry, Tim, but I do think this bears on the question of we have a constitution that, you know, its basic design is 200 plus years old, right? And so to the extent to which the founders created a system that can it or can it not withhold society's demands and society's values today, I think that's kind of like the general theme of this larger discussion is like, does the design itself hold for 2022 given the issues we're facing today? That to me is the more pertinent issues for the students to think about, rather than, oh, we shouldn't have a Department of Education because Hamilton wouldn't have wanted it. I just want to make clear, I'm not arguing that we should just do what the founders would have wanted. I'm not saying that at all.
Oh, so you're not Alito's best friend.
One more thing, David. You asked, you used the phrase in the context of the House and the Senate and the founders, good government. Now, I would recommend for our consideration that they created a government and saw good government as people being represented and states being represented. So I think for them, it's important for us to think a little bit about what they wanted good government to be representationally. So in that sense, I think the original Constitution did theoretically, because I think that was in your question as well, theoretically it represented people in the House, and theoretically it represented the state's interests. So they succeeded in that. Now, I think it flies off the rails when we're challenging this notion of, do states still need representation? And I might get a little grumbly too about the nature of the Senate not representing states, and or are states ultimately still relevant to good government?
So let's kind of get into that notion of representation with Professor Kavanaugh here. In many government and civics textbooks, the authors will talk about the competing theories of representation, the delegate theory and the trustee theory or trustee model. Professor Kavanaugh, are both of these legitimate theories of representation, or are they out there in la la land, aspirational and theoretical? What's your view about at least those two theories?
Yeah, I think there are legitimate, but I don't think they're the only ones. I mean, you have obviously for students digging into this, we'll try and put a link to some Edmund Burke. He's maybe considered that the father of that trustee model, right? As opposed to the delegate model. I was like, if you're not sure what the trustee model means, is trust the people you elect to make the decisions that will be best for you. That delegate idea is more of that mirror representation, right? So those people that we send are going to mirror their constituents, if that's possible. But there's a Politico model, not to be confused with the online publication. It's the idea that it's a combination of the first two. The elected official will kind of follows the trustee model until their constituents push them towards that delegate model on certain issues. And there's also the partisan model. This is where I think where we see ourselves more today is the partisan model is voting on party lines. And that's it's in this era of hyper polarization, to use that term, I think we see that much more so in terms of partisan voting, as opposed to that trustee and delegate theory. I think the trustee and delegate theories, I think they're very valid. I think that elected officials will maybe go between the two. I always think of, when I think of the trustee model, I can't help but thinking of Profiles in Courage, the book that Kennedy got to put his name on that he didn't write. But the whole concept of, senators going against a popular will prior to the 17th Amendment, because of their viewpoint, was much more national in scope than it was in state in scope. But I think there are different models of representation for the students to examine.
Yeah, I think, again, because they're part of the academic framework of which political scientists have structured all this. I will, to me, the only one that matters is partisan. One, I see the trustee model. Ironically, you mentioned Burke. What happened to Burke in the next election?
I don't know.
He lost.
Yeah.
His notion of the trustee, so again, I think the trustee model, we have some excitement. We could use Liz Cheney as an example of the trustee model, right? In the last couple of years.
Great
and again,
point.
She lost her election partly because she was not reflecting the delegate theory. And Wyoming might be one of the few places in this country where the delegate theory works. But I look at California. How in the heck is a member of Congress, all right, supposed to know what the people want on a weekly basis when they represent 750,000 people? How are they supposed to disseminate what the voice of the people is? Or is it just the voice of the people who voted for them? And that's not the true delegate theory. That's the partisan principle there.
Well, I'd recommend for our consideration. I mean, the Anti-Federalist, when I think it was Patrick Henry in the Virginia convention said he looked at the Constitution and he had horrific problems with one to 30,000. He had one because he looked at the Senate. Are you kidding me? 26. The House was 65, and and he could do the math. And you looked at the population of the country. So the Anti-Federalists looked at this ratio problem from the very beginning, and and actually Henry in the debates at Virginia used the word, this whole Constitution is virtual representation, and that's very heated language for folks that lived through the Revolution, because that was a part of the revolutionary ethos, that it was virtual representation. So imagine if Patrick Henry, and there are others that see virtual representation in 1 to 30,000 and also in the Senate, and the filtering out of the people when it comes to the presidency, and the filtering out of the people when it comes to this judiciary. I don't think we have delegate representation anywhere. I mean, it's all virtual if you're an anti-federalist to start with, and it's certainly virtual now.
Mike, any thoughts on these, since you're the political scientist?
I was going to say, let's hear from the political scientist.
Yeah, I mean, the organization that gave us this whole vocabulary here, so.
No, I mean, I agree with what Tim and Chris have said. I like Tim adding the additional sort of ways to be thinking about this. And I do think that what Tim's raising is super important, just about the size of the population and what it means to have a democratic republic with that many people being represented. It really is, it's something really serious to think about. And then when you think about those communities that do have population sizes that make more sense, local elections, you don't see near the type of engagement or the voter turnout or anything from people at that level where they could really maybe make a difference. So I do think it's something that students should be thinking about.
So continuing with you, Professor Williams, many scholars and Mann and Ornstein lead the way on this, have argued that Congress and the system designed by the framers is broken, and in fact has been broken for a number of decades now. Do you agree with that it's broken?
I do, yeah. I mean, I think that whether it's a few things or just some big things, I think our government has not been addressing some of the issues that really need to be addressed. And to the extent that they're not addressing those issues, whether it's climate change, whether it's the just the health of democracy itself, whether it's immigration, as I think Chris mentioned. I mean, these are all issues that everyone knows. This is the role of government, is to make some dent, do something incrementally to start addressing this. And to the extent that we're not doing it, I would say, yeah, it's definitely a system that it's not functioning in a way to solve it should be solving some basic problems. In addition to solving the representation issue that Tim is focusing on, I also think that government's there to just solve some basic problems for society. And I don't see the current government, Democrat or Republicans, doing that the last few decades.
So I'm going to give you three things that I believe are the major contributors or contributions to the breaking of this institution. And I'd like you to rank them. What would you put at the top of the list?
I like
social,
it. Yeah, let's go.
Yeah. All right. And then if Professor Moore or Kavanaugh disagree with you, they can change that.
I feel like we need a visual or something for this, like something to come across the screen, like, weigh the options or something. This is great.
Right, but that would require me having technological knowledge on how to do that. And of course, we're dealing with a troglodyte here on the screen. So social media, political parties, or money? Which do you put at the top of the list for the breaking? Social media, political parties, or money?
Money.
So go ahead, as we would in a hearing, defend that position.
Well, I think that as we were just talking about, members of Congress have lots of people in their districts that they should be listening to and hearing their views when making decisions. But members of Congress, their first goal, and it's always been this first goal, is to get reelected because they believe that Congress is better with them than without them. And what the role of money does is it means that certain interests get the ear of members of Congress more than other folks. And I think that to the extent that members of Congress are not addressing those basic issues that we would say need to be addressed, a lot of that is caused because there are major special interests that it's in their benefit not to have some of those issues addressed, to have the status quo. So, political parties that's a close one for me, but I'm going to go with money.
Professor Kavanaugh, are you with Professor Williams on that?
Oh, yes, I am very much so, because we've had political parties from the jump, and we were still able to get things done. We have political parties since we've started the country.
Yeah, but those parties they function differently. They're organized differently. Their power is different.
Time out. Were they political parties? Yes, they were political parties. So we've had political parties, and social media is new. What is the driving force? And this is what frustrates me with the last bullet of the question. I just pulled it up and I just was taking a look at it. Most influence on congressional representatives, the interests of their constituents, party leadership, or ideology. And I would be, for the students listening to this, I would say it's got to be special interests, some money. You think about this. We have politicians that have taken so much money from fossil fuel industries, and that we're able to put out information about climate change, much like the tobacco companies put out information about cigarettes. And now we still, have elected lawmakers that deny the, climate change. And so what happens is when we should be responding to the threats, these are not existential threats, these are real threats to our environment. We still have people that are beholden to special interests and large money. And if you just said earlier that how much are they spent so far in Georgia for that Senate seat?
Both candidates are in the 70 millions.
That's crazy money. Crazy money. So
I'm going to take. Obviously, it's fallen on me to be the contrarian. Although I don't know that I disagree with either Mike or Chris, but I think there might be an argument here that the lack of political party power is a part of the problem that Congress is not working right. For example, you think about with all these great stories about Lyndon Johnson, how he got stuff done. You get summoned to the White House for lunch, you were going to get yelled at until you said yes, Mr. Lyndon, I will vote for that. Do you think for a minute that Joe Manchin would survive a Lyndon Johnson barrage if he didn't toe the party line. So I think, as I understand it, there's all kinds of political science literature that has said the collapse of centralized party control over their candidates, I think for the Democrats starting in the 70s, has contributed to the lack of cohesion. So in other words, I think when people run for Congress, they don't run much with political party support. Now, the rebuttal to that is the Republican Party right now, because I think there is a Lyndon Johnson running the Republican Party. So I see a lot of similarities between Trump and Johnson in how they influence their political party to bend that party to their will. But at a micro level, I think the lack of party control on the Democratic side has created some inefficiency and brokenness of Congress.
Well, I'm going to, of course, take my alternative path here in the sense that money and parties, I'll agree with you, have been with us for a very long time. We can go back at least 100 years, and the progressives, Roosevelt, they're trying to deal with the influence of money. In fact, they do. We get legislation and stuff like that. And the parties, I'll agree with you, but Mann and Ornstein, they specifically point at Gingrich in the 1990s. There is kind of the beginning part of really the breaking of Congress, and I see that coinciding, Chris, with the rise of communication systems and eventually social media. And I think social media exasperates both money and parties to such a degree, because the speed of which negative information, disinformation, misinformation can be spread, and truth is so far behind in its ability to catch up, and also responsiveness of constituents to especially the small minority who actually participate. I kind of put it at the doorstep of social media.
Well, I want to think about, because David, I'm thinking about listening to Tim, what he's saying about political parties, and I'm thinking about our current state of affairs, which I would describe as being pretty poor right now. So if we had people that in leadership in political parties, when you have a member that is stepping out spewing misinformation, I'm going to use that word. I'm going to use that verb, spewing, because that's what it's right. If they were to come in and slap that person down, saying, "No, that's not what we're about," right? We're trying to expand our big tent. Right. To go back to that idea.
Right.
So if we had a tighter party control, but they don't rein in those members, because those members are actually able to fundraise, right? Or Tim, you have made I think the comparison between the former President Trump and Lyndon Johnson.
Yep. Well, that's why I don't disagree with you that I think the money is tied to that. To your point originally, that money is the root of all this evil. But yeah, I mean, if there's a strong Republican leadership, they'd tell Marjorie Greene to sit down, shut up, go to the corner. And the Democrats would tell some of their fringe folks to slow down, sit in the corner, and be quiet. But I don't think they have that control, because candidates are really independent of the party right now.
Well, but I think, but I do, and I'm going to push back, and maybe this is my own personal bias, but I do think that even though you have members like AOC, and you have more progressive members within the Democratic Party, I think they've learned too that to get things done, they have to, they can't be on all the time, so to speak.
Right.
But now within the Republican Party, you have people that are, espousing openly fascist ideas. I mean, really, it's what it's come down to. We have people espousing fascist ideas, and as guys that all read this stuff constantly, the threat to democracy is real. And
are you therefore saying that ideology is a key factor? Because fascism is an ideology. So,
well, I liken it to the rise of Hitler in Germany and the Nazi Party, where you had some people in power in the old Weimar Republic in the late 20s and into the early 30s that thought, oh, well, this guy's really popular. And maybe we can get behind this guy, but we can support him, but we can, we'll be able to control him. But the trouble was that popularity spread so much and it was so fervent and people drank the Kool-Aid so thoroughly that it was like riding a tiger. You can't jump off whenever you want to. And I think that we're seeing the end result of that now. And, goodness.
Well, Mike, I'm wondering, as a political scientist, when we look at ideology, do you think either of the two major parties have a cohesive ideology?
Like a governing ideology, not what Chris is talking about.
Well, political ideology, that includes governing. I guess their governing ideology is to win, and have power, right? But however you want to define it, as I understand, ideology is kind of like, we used to have party platforms that articulated what the ideology was. That doesn't seem to matter much. I can't find a cohesive ideology in either party. Whether, again, limited government, limited federal government versus expansive federal government. It used to be an ideological split there. They're all over the place on both sides of the aisle. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I think I would agree with that, Dave. I mean, I'm trying to think through right now. I don't know if any. I don't know if this counts as an ideology. I think the Democrats are trying to be like open and inclusive, but I think to some extent they're doing that to their own detriment, right? I think I was just watching today, President Obama was on a podcast recently kind of talking about the way Democrats sometimes make people feel, right? But I do think there's a lean into like, we're better if we're more accepting of everyone's sort of, let me put the spin on it, everyone's human dignity and everyone's way of moving through the world. And I see the Republicans as having this more closed off ideology about who is a rightful participant in our democracy, I guess I would say. But I'm not sure if it's, in the good old days, I guess people would sit down and think about this. I mean, Republicans and Democrats, as you said, thought about their principles were about, should government have a role or should government not have a role? We're way beyond that. I don't think Nancy Pelosi and Biden and Schumer, they're not sitting around thinking about these ideology things in a way that I think, the Democrats in the 1950s and 60s were seriously thinking about it and having conversations with themselves. Like, do we want to be Kennedy Democrats? Do we want to be Humphrey Democrats? I mean, there was a serious discussion. I don't see that happening.
No, as always, time is our enemy. So it is our time to kind of wrap up. And so I'd like each of our scholars to take a moment and provide some key insights, recommendations on this topic of Congress and representation, polarization for the students and teachers that are watching out there. So, excuse me, Professor Kavanaugh.
Oh gosh, whatever Mike and Tim say, that's what I'm going to go with. No, I think it's, you can see
they're in trouble until you listen to me.
Well, this is going to be a really difficult thing to do because it's difficult for me, right, is to keep my own personal biases out of my discussion, and I have to own that, right? That I have to own that I let my own personal frustrations and biases, especially with the status quo as it is right now, in our society. So it's difficult for me. So I think I would warn the students to, because you want passion in your presentation, but you want it in a way that's reasoned. And so I would warn you not to be like me. Don't let your personal biases slip in to this discussion. And also on that last bullet, I would say, make sure you're throwing in special interest of money. Cause I think that, I think the question itself is lacking in terms of in that regard. But and again, I said this last time, and if you think it's broken, how do we fix it? Have an idea about how we fix it. And there are a lot of political scientists out there, like young Mike Williams right there, that have ideas, that have been publishing ideas about if our system is not working the way it should, how should it? And so think about having those solutions as well.
Professor Moore.
Yeah, I would urge students to think about the basic question of we've always wrestled about what's good representation, and two, what needs to be represented. So I think the one bullet that point in the question that sorts out, what constituents or interests or political parties, there are so many other things I think to think about that, should they be represented? Should business actually have representatives so we've always wrestled with what needs to be represented. And take a look at history at the various times when we've really struggled with, because often what needs to be represented drives the question of what's good representation. So I would urge students to think about that historical thing that we've lived with, what needs to be represented.
Professor Williams?
Yeah, I have two comments. This question is written so narrowly. I think the students, there's not really an opportunity. There's not an opportunity to think outside the bounds of Congress. But I would just say that spend a little bit of time maybe just talking with yourselves about the good old days when there was less polarization. We call that the Cold War period. And our institutions are affected by what's going on in the broader world. I think the post-Cold War, post-war on terror, I think all those things matter. So it's not, I can't see where you get that into this question, but I do think it's something interesting for you to be thinking about. The one aspect of this question we didn't talk about tonight that I would encourage you to think about is examples of political compromise, right? Think about those times in our history where there have been what you would decide as political compromise, and kind of do some backwards thinking about, okay, why was it possible at this moment to get this compromise and not get it at other times? And there have been times the last 2 years, there's been, I think we can call political compromise over a couple acts of Congress. I wouldn't try to build those into your answer, to try to then think through what are the dynamics there that are important.
I think these are all good insights. I would push back a little bit on what Professor Kavanaugh said. I don't have a problem. First of all, the way this event works is you're a unit made up from 3, and I've seen teams with 6 members on a panel. Your individual bias doesn't bother me, and I think bias can be reasonably defended. And I think especially if there's a group of you, is if you have different biases and those different biases are able to be articulated with historical and legal and philosophical reasons, that can be a very dynamic hearing. So I don't want you to restrain yourself, students, from what you actually believe there, but make sure that you have a reasoned argument to justify whatever that bias might be there. So the highlight for me in this whole program was that Professor Kavanaugh actually admitted that he read the question before we met there. So that's always a sign of progress as we move forward.
Guilty.
Next week, or next session, we're going to be talking about kind of the interaction of the judicial branch and the amendment process there, which I look forward to. I've read an awful lot about this, of what we call the judicial oligarchy and its connection to the amendment process. So until then, peace, love, Younger Tacos. Bye-bye, bye-bye.